Right, so this is going to be a recreation of a lesson I just ran with my year 11s. I didn't push record early enough in the class to get kind of most of the guts of what we were doing, so I thought I'd just kind of go back over and recreate that lesson. So hopefully that's going to be a much smoother process than it was in the actual, I guess, kind of tutorial, because we won't have kind of individuals asking little questions and things like that I guess just pertained to them. So what the class actually was how to kind of get a rough storyline or an idea for a story out of a prompt. Okay, so I picked a random passage from the book, took, I think it was two lines from the book, and just kind of worked through how I would turn that into some kind of narrative that connected to the ideas of Ransom. And, you could craft a creative response from. So as I've already done this, I'm going to kind of be flicking back forwards between the notes I wrote then and here, just to make sure that it's consistent with what we did. So if there's any weird pauses, that's what's going on. But this was kind of something that I very much did on the spur of the moment and kind of crafted in a very organic way. So that the kind of way it unfolds is how and the order I thought of it in. So I'm going to share across to the prompt now, and we'll just have a quick read of that. So this is the lines I pulled out. It's just after the section where Achilles kind of, or Maloof rather, details how Achilles and Patroclus became bound. So it's right after that kind of passage. What Achilles saw then on the clouded brow was what had been so struck by in the first glance that had passed between them, the daunted look that had captured his soul before he even knew that he had one, and he would hear again, as if the memory were his own, and what Patroclus was hearing, the knock of bone on bone as two lives collided and were irrevocably changed. Okay, so that's our prompt. And I guess we've got to look at our themes. So let's jump our themes in and kind of figure out which ones we're going to focus on here. Okay, because I think it's quite important that we're making sure that from the outset we're looking at, different, I guess, aspects. And the thing with this prompt, aspects from the text, the thing with this prompt is it's all about connection, I guess, and this idea that two lives, or really three, if we consider the young boy who died to bring Patroclus there, were melded together and somehow crafted this bond or this connection that Achilles and Patroclus share. The thing that's most important for me, I think gives us a bit more artistic freedom, is this. So it's not two lives were collided and, they were joyously linked, or they shared a loving bond or anything like that. This prompt says two lives collided and they were irrevocably changed. So what we can do is we can present a connection and then just change up that relationship, change up those lives, but still keep them bound through something. Okay. And I kind of wanted to stay true to the original text in a sense, in that, I wanted to look at some kind of a momentous occasion causing some kind of bond to form. And actually, in this sense, like the death of the child as some kind of stimulus or catalyst for this reaction taking place. So let's bring that across. So I'm going to take kind of the rough stuff from Ransom's, not going to be bolded, and my kind of ideas will be. I'll just copy it across from the other document in the interest of saving time whilst typing. Okay, so Patroclus and Achilles become linked by a mantis event, the death of a child. So I wanted to explore the idea of two people becoming linked. Okay, I think I want to explore the link in a marriage union, because then we can link back to Hecuba and Priam. And I think that provides us, a platform through which to discuss various elements of the text and not get too pigeonholed, whilst, making the natural kind of nature of that connection quite apparent to the reader from the outset. So let's have a look at that. And I think I want to focus on the loss of their child, because then we can just quite quickly link it back to the death of the child in Ransom. That kind of creates this link and this idea that, you know, death creates new relationships. You know, it's through the death of Hector that we see that link formed, I guess, between Priam and Achilles, where they find some kind of mutual ground and share grief to a degree. Okay, so here we have our themes. I'm going to cut a few out because I've already kind of roughly come up with this idea. I think we don't need to worry so much about identity. We don't need to worry about violence so much. Whilst it's in Ransom, you know, it is quite a violent death the child suffers. The loss of the child, I think, is going to be more passive event. And we discussed in the lecture I gave that, you know, maybe the child drowns in a pool or something like that. Something that's, you know, not really going to become the focal point of the story, because that's not what we want to discuss. We don't want to discuss the death of that child. We want to discuss the result of that death, the link that forms from that occasion. Okay, so we can get rid of war as well. Don't need it. You could explore storytelling. And when I was talking to my class, we looked at, I guess, the idea that Somax is telling the story of Ransom, as we find out. And, you know, we could definitely tell this story in a way that fitted into that. But in the interest of keeping the piece focused and, you know, not writing a piece that's too open-ended given the time constraints and assessment, I'm going to not focus on that aspect and not write through that format. Okay, so I'm going to focus on humanity, because I think these links that they're implying exist between people are very much between people. You know, it's a very human thing to have, I guess, a soulmate or that kind of idea, or some kind of unbreakable bond. Family tensions, because what we've got here is obviously mother, father, child. In Ransom, I guess Achilles' family dynamic somewhat changes with the introduction of Patroclus, but also quite importantly, we've got this idea of Hecuba and Priam we can bring in, and I guess the family tension they experience, particularly at the death of so many sons during this war, and the strain that puts on Hecuba. And I think that's going to be an interesting kind of dynamic to explore, because whilst this prompt, you know, is Achilles, the death of Hector, you know, impacts Priam and Hecuba in similar ways. You know, they feel that grief and they act on that grief. We see Hecuba kind of lose that decorum for which he's previously known. We see Priam, I guess, strip himself of the title of king to be a father, to go get Hector's body back. So we can definitely use that family tension aspect. And obviously displacement and loss, I'm going to just take that loss, of course, the loss of the child. And the thing is too, what we can do here and where we can use this theme is looking at this idea. So whilst, you know, Patroclus formed that strong positive bond with Achilles, we can twist this on its head and show the other side of the coin. Because to me, Ransom's about cycles. It's about opposite sides. It's about life and death. We can show, well, in Ransom, yes, that kind of event leads to this positive, strong bond, but it can also lead to kind of the destruction of a relationship or the changing of the nature of a relationship in a less than positive manner. So we see, I guess, this husband and wife who are now linked forever by the grief of losing a child, but through that themselves separate emotionally or become detached emotionally. And I think that would be a really interesting kind of dynamic to explore. So I'm just going to flick back to my notes and copy across kind of what we need there. And I'll just talk through that again, clear up anything that I've left out. Okay, so they're linked by the loss of the child. Their lives were irrevocably changed for the worse. They're stuck together out of guilt, unable to conceive another child, but their loss has rendered them miserable. Okay, so they are linked by that experience when that moment happened, and I guess their lives and their experience collided in that way. Okay. Now this line that I copied in there, I And if you watch the video I put up, I talked about how I like to use stylistic kind of ins to write in an author's space, you know, for me to access the thematic kind of ideas that Maloof has. I like to bring myself in by writing structurally and using the same kind of techniques he does. And one line that I pulled out of my piece was the knock of bone on bone. And I think that's a really, really typical line of Maloof, that kind of poetry of it, the kind of roughness that's kind of implied by what he writes. And I think you could use this to create some kind of dialogue or some kind of passage around them desperately trying to resuscitate the child. And, you know, I think too what we can do there is we can put that in the same way Patroclus and Hector, you know, their deaths are covered in the text, but they happen before the action. I think we can do the same thing, kind of open with this moment, but it's in the past for the frame of the rest of the story, if that makes sense. And I think there's a real chance to use that real focus on alliteration, consternation, and rhythmic kind of language that Maloof employs, as well as kind of metaphor, to create something that language-wise is beautiful, but has kind of dark undertones. And that's I think the way we can get into the space to write this story. Begin with that. I think it would be quite a nice, solid into this story. So I wrote a little passage just to show my class what that might look like, at least in a very small kind of form. And this is what I came up with just off the cuff. I'd probably edit this a bit more and make it a bit more descriptive in order to get that overly descriptive kind of feel of Maloof's work. So the flex of the man's muscle creating pressure which splintered the ribs which formed the child's chassis, cracking his frame like dry twigs that could serve as kindling. Okay, we get that real rhythmic flow. And if you look at this part here, so formed the child's chassis, cracking his frame, which could serve as kindling. Like there's that hard sound which allows the passage to flow. And, you know, while that might roll off the tongue, if you actually read what it's saying, that the child's ribs are being broken as the father of this child attempts to resuscitate it. And I think there's a degree of Maloof in that the beauty of his language kind of covers the grief and the violence and those kind of more horrific aspects of the content he's actually writing on. And, you know, that's a tragic moment, and that's definitely something we see. I also talked with my class about, I guess, using the death of Hector here. And, you know, you could even refer to the child. The child could be called Hector, and you could just make an easy parallel that way at a surface level. But I think, as I said, start with this. You could structurally consider it similar to the death of Hector, but also you could create some kind of juxtaposition there. So I guess between the battle to save something and the battle to kill. So Hector and Achilles obviously are battling to kill one another. This man's battling to save his child. And I think you could do something really interesting by using very similar language, and even, if you can, drawing direct passages from Maloof's description of fighting and killing to describe this kind of battle to save life. I think that would be a really interesting way of approaching this kind of conversation here. And it kind of moves into that cyclical kind of nature of things we see in Ransom, the dual nature of everything that Maloof kind of presents, and the idea that, you know, there's two sides, and we see the Greeks and the Trojans, the Greeks kind of fighting to sack Troy, the Trojans trying to save it. And I think there's a really interesting dynamic that can be explored in that little passage there. Okay, so that's how I wanted to start my story, you know, with that kind of moment, with that death, and you could talk about the structural mirrors to Ransom, as I said. Then we've got to think about our middle, and this is obviously where I use less detail, because I'd already spent quite a bit of time detailing this thought process. So I just kind of gave my students some rough kind of dot points on how I would continue the story and where I'd end up. So I would change protagonists. I tried to do so fluently like Maloof, the way he kind of naturally transitions from not quite direct perspective, but definitely from providing the action from a physical point of view of someone else. And I would probably switch from the husband in that start scene to the wife who's going to carry the rest of my piece. I might have her sitting silently in the kitchen smoking. I think if you do that, there's something so tactile, so physical, gives you plenty of opportunity to explore the writing style of Maloof and work around with that description and that metaphor that he employs. And husband doing something else in the kitchen. So he's there, but there's a kind of separation between them. So you're, exploring that kind of idea of the change in their relationship, that it's now separated. And you can definitely look at a scene of Maloof when Priam wakes up and we first introduced him as kind of some kind of, I guess, inspiration for there to draw directly from Maloof. Or perhaps the opening passages of the book where we see Achilles wrecked by grief and, that they're not speaking, but we get a sense of what they're feeling, what they're thinking. And I said to my students, it might be interesting to actually not have your protagonists directly talk to one another, to show that change, and have the death of the child was the catalyst for the death of their relationship. And I said somewhat mirrors Hecuba and Priam. I'm not implying that their relationship dies, but just that there's massive changes in that connection based on the death of children. Yeah, and then to finish off, I said we need some kind of win. Okay, we can't have them, I don't think, to properly stay within the style, within the themes and feelings of Ransom. We can't have them have another child. We see Somax lose his family. We see Priam and Hecuba lose their sons. We see Achilles lose Patroclus, and none of those people are replaced. We can't have the big hammy Hollywood ending where they conceive another child and everything's okay, because it's not going to be. And to stay true to this kind of prompt, we have to, I guess, make sure that it is changed forever. And so whilst they can't recover from the loss, they can move forward somewhat. Ignore the bad grammar and spelling. But just as Achilles allows Priam to take Hector, we have to have some small, almost mundane win. And to me, maybe that's they say a few words with each other at the close of the piece. And I think that might be an interesting way to explore that small kind of win. Okay. All right. That's all I have on that. Hopefully that helps you kind of see how you can pull apart a prompt and draw ideas out of it. And, hopefully that's going to help you with your creative writing.